it is time. Welcome to all of you to this second part of our conference. After the exciting meetings and presentations of yesterday, we come now to the lecture by Professor Robin Dunbar about the centerpiece of the Neolithic. Robin Dunbar is professor of evolutionary psychology at the University of Oxford, and his research focused on the evolution of sociality in primates and other mammals. This brings together understanding brain evolution, relationship between brain regions, cognition, and behavior. Dunbar's number became now as a cognitive limit to the number of people with which one can maintain stable social relationships, and this now a standard notion. He recently is developing work on religion, evolution, and the social brain, and it is on this topic that he will present today. I would like to put the lecture by Professor Dunbar today in the context of other meetings we have already on evolution. We started in 2014 with this meeting in London with the computational biologist Richard Dorbin, in his researcher in the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute in Kingston, Cambridge, and he is professor at the University of Cambridge. And another talk was important for our work is the talk by Mark Thomas, who is a professor for evolutionary genetics in University College London, and it is Mark Thomas who recommended me to contact Professor Robin Dunbar. With these meetings with Richard Dorbin and Mark Thomas, we addressed the question at which time did the sharp distinction between sapiens and non-sapiens we have today become established. And we have discussed this important study by 23 leading scientists. Among them is Richard Dorbin and also Mark Thomas. And the result of this study is that Homo sapiens reaches the full set of features we see in living people today at the end of the Pleistocene, beginning of the Neolithic. And on the other hand, we have this important statement by Robin Dunbar that the centerpiece of the Neolithic is the invention of mechanisms that allowed people to live together in cramped conditions without killing each other. So it looks like the Neolithic is especially relevant for to have humanity as it is today, mainly because of two facts. The difference between humans and animals becomes as distinct as it is today at the Neolithic. And the other fact is disappearance of mechanisms allowing people to live together without killing each other. So I would like to ask Professor Dunbar to explain us his theory about these mechanisms. Please.
Thank you very much. So I'm really going to talk about the origins of what you might think of as modern religion, in particular, that's to say doctrinal religions, and their apparent appearance for the first time in the Neolithic. But I want to put this into the bigger picture of why humans have religions at all. Why did the capacity for religiosity, if you like, evolve in humans? Okay, so what I think we have to explain is this general perception that goes way back, I think, into the 19th century among scholars of the history of religion and the history of culture as well, that religions have evolved essentially in a two-step manner, that early religions were shamanic in form, often based around trance. They're what I refer to as immersive religions, in the sense they often don't have religious specialists or priests or whatever you care to call them, that they're things that everybody does. This is a sort of Durkheimian view of primitive religions, as we might call it, if you like. And that at some later point, a group of much more elaborated religions, which usually go under the name of doctrinal religions because they have formal doctrines and, if you like, formal theologies, arose and came to dominate the world religious space, if you like, and hence they're often known as world religions. I want to make four claims, in fact. One is that the central function of religion historically has been community bonding, that this transition from shamanic to doctrinal religions resulted primarily from a shift in the demographic conditions under which humans were living, that the doctrinal religions themselves have not replaced shamanic religions, but actually an accretion on top of this shamanic base. And indeed, that shamanic base I'm equating really with a sense of mysticism and mystical experiences, often based around trance. And hence I kind of sometimes refer to this as a sort of mystical stance, as it were. And understanding the history of religions and how they've evolved historically might explain a lot of what we see in contemporary religions. So just to go back to the beginning, if you like, just to set the framework, if we look at religions in small-scale societies, as I'm sure most of you are well aware, these are often associated with trance experiences, the access to the transcendent and other worlds, if you like. And these have played a very crucial role in all these small-scale society religions all over the world and through time as well. Mostly this takes the form of shamanic practices, although one has to beware of terminological war that exists around the term shaman and shamanic, because these technically, in the strict sense, are property of mostly Siberian cultures. But I'm kind of using shamanic practices in a much looser sense, which allows us to refer to passing into trance states more generally, and that these are, seen in that light. These phenomena are extremely widespread among all small-scale societies, hunter-gatherer societies, small horticultural societies, as well as modern practices, obviously in the mystical based dimensions that all the major world religions still have. Very often in small-scale societies, trance is induced by dancing or other physical exertion properties, but it can clearly be induced by other practices. You think of the yogic tradition, the Buddhist meditation traditions, even within Christianity, some of the trance traditions, trance-based traditions. It can be introduced by much softer, if you like, and less brute force mechanisms. And of course, in small-scale societies, and some, particularly in South America, it's often also associated with psychotropic drugs. So in this context, religion is something, it seems to me, that you experience. It's an experiential religion or immersive religion. Everybody's involved. There aren't really specialists, even though some individuals may be regarded as able to do these things better and more effectively than others. They may or they may not be associated with things like the capacity to predict the future, or to engage in curing diseases and enhancing fertility, and all these other kinds of things that get packed into particularly the shamanic practices in the strong sense of the kind of Siberian form, I think. So this is the background. This is very, very early religion. Now, the context in which any of this stuff evolves really comes back to our position among the primates, our nearest zoological relatives. And remember, we are a member of the ape family before we are a member of the wider primate family. So, you know, we are not sort of an addendum to the primates from a biological point of view. We are well embedded within one particular branch of that, and quite an ancient branch, which predates a lot of the evolution of a lot of the monkeys. But the important issue here is really what's known as the social brain hypothesis, which is this explanation for why primates have unusually large brains. And the argument is that their big evolutionary strategic development has been an intense form of sociality. And this requires a big computer, essentially, to manage the cognitive complexity that's involved. And one of the core bits of evidence to support this was this graph here, which plots mean social group size in different species of monkeys against monkeys and apes against some measure of brain size. It turns out that you can more or less use any measure of brain size you like, but the fits are much the best with what's become known as neocortex ratio, which is the ratio of the neocortex to the rest of the brain, the subcortical brain, which is in some sense probably a measure of differential investment in those parts of the brain that are involved in high order cognitive processing. So these are the data that I'm plotting here. And I simply draw your attention to the fact that where once upon a time we thought this was a uniform, single homogeneous distribution, it turns out not to be the case. In fact, there are grades in these data, and the grades are illustrated by the lines on the graph, which essentially reflect socially more simple, cognitively less smart monkeys. The right-hand blue line, socially more complex monkeys with cognitively more smart capacities, and then over on the right in the red line, the apes. And it's really the apes that we have to worry about. Statistically, there's been a lot of confusion sown by people who will insist on putting a general regression through the whole lot. And of course, that produces a much lower slope. Now that we've understood that these grades exist in these data for the last 50 years, actually. But everybody seems to ignore the fact or not read the literature. I'm not sure which. What we have to worry about is where the apes lie, because humans sit on the ape line. We know what the neocortex ratio is for humans because we have them in the same database. If you plug humans into that line, ape line, and then read across, you get a predicted value of about 150. That's the value that's now known as Dunbar's number. At least to say it is Dunbar's number for humans, because of course each of these other primate species has its own equivalent Dunbar's number. So the argument runs is the sort of generic, basic, natural grouping size for humans. That's the size of group in which we have evolved, if you like, to handle and to live in effectively. It doesn't mean to say we can't live in much bigger mega communities, but this is the sort of core basis to that, and the most cognitively functional, in the sense that the brain is designed to handle this kind of social world. So if you look at some of the evidence for this, this is data on community sizes or personal network sizes drawn from a very large range of sources, everything from historical village societies. These are actually medieval and late medieval village sizes in England and in northern Italy in this particular set here, but the size of congregations in various kinds of Christian denominations, science networks, the size of weddings. These are American weddings, email networks, social media networks, so Facebook, number of friends on Facebook, phone call networks, so it's the data from national telephone databases, how many people are in your phone book who are social people, as it were, as opposed to your lawyer and your butcher and baker. And then personal social networks. Now here's the predicted value of 150, the solid line across the middle. The dotted lines are the 95% confidence intervals around that from the 8 prediction. And you can see all these values cluster very tightly around the 150, but all of them fall within the 95% confidence intervals. That's, this seems to be a very, very robust effect as a natural kind of grouping size. Now, the question then arises is how primates create these social groups of theirs. Primates have a very distinct, or at least anthropoid primates, let's say monkeys and apes, have a very distinct kind of society based on bonded relationships. So these are very personalized. They involve the investment of a lot of time with this kind of activity, social grooming to other individuals. And they're very specific. So if you look at the structure of grooming networks in groups, animals do not groom with everybody in the group. They groom only with their best friends. But the amount of time they devote to grooming, and therefore the amount of investment in these particular relationships, increases with group size. So as the group gets bigger, you need to have your good friendships, as it were, working more and more efficiently. And that depends purely on your investment in social grooming. And the reason for that is that social grooming seems to work through a particular pharmacological system in the brain, the endorphin system, which is part of the brain's pain management system. And there's a special neural circuit from the skin, particularly the hairy skin, to the brain, which responds only to light, slow stroking. And it's very specific. It only responds to, the receptors only respond to stroking at around 2.5 centimeters a second. If you stroke faster or you stroke slower, the neurons don't fire. If you get it right, the neurons fire, go up to the brain and trigger an endorphin response. The brain gets flooded with endorphins. It gives you an opiate high, if you like. You feel very relaxed, very engaged with the person you're doing this kind of activity with. The weight of the world seems to drop from your shoulders. You feel very trusting and very calm as a result of it. And this interacts with the cognitive component of building relationships, which is where the social brain and the cognition comes in. So it's what we psychologists will call a two-process mechanism. There are two mechanisms within the brain that are working in parallel to build these very intense, personalized, bonded relationships, which are pretty unique among the birds and mammals. There's only a small number of other mammals that have these kinds of relationships, although they seem to be typical of reproductive pair bonds, monogamous pair bonds, which quite a few species have. But primates are the only ones which show an elaboration of this mechanism from pair bonds into friends. And it's these that create this kind of glue that holds the group together and gives it its stability. So we know from pharmacological work that it's the endorphin system in primates that underpins grooming. Here's some evidence from one of our PET scanning studies carried out by my collaborators in Finland, showing the human brain lighting up in response to endorphin activation by being stroked very gently on the torso. So this is everywhere in the brain except at the back in the visual system at the back here, but respond because there are no receptors, but these are essentially the receptors lighting up like crazy in the rest of the brain, particularly up in the frontal areas here, which are the areas that are particularly known to be heavily involved in managing relationships. So here's direct evidence the same mechanism is actually involved. Now, the problem with grooming is that it's very time costly. The quality of your friendship depends explicitly on the amount of time you spend grooming with them in both humans and monkeys and apes. And that sets an upper limit on group size. And that upper limit is determined ultimately by the amount of time you can afford to spend grooming. And that seems to have an upper limit at about 20% of the day. So that's 1/5 of the day can be spent engaged in social grooming by the most social monkeys and apes. Now, if you figure out from the various equations relating brain size to group size and group size to grooming time requirement, what the grooming time requirement would be for all our fossil ancestors, this is the picture you get. So this is percentage of the day devoted to grooming. This is time going back in millions of years. These are the earliest hominins, Australopithecines, going up through early Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, up into the archaic humans, the Neanderthals, and the Heidelberg folk, and into fossil modern humans. So these are not us. These are actually fossil modern humans. And then the line is what we would predict for modern humans, which is about 45% of the day would have to be spent grooming to bond a group as big as 150. And it's clearly way in excess of the amount of time any species can afford to devote to grooming. So the key problem is this gap here, the bonding gap, that somehow we had to fill. And the way we think now that was filled was progressively through a series of behaviors which came into play or were discovered, if you like, as also triggering the endorphin system. The earliest of these is undoubtedly laughter, and this is kind of a genetic component and probably we think probably comes in about here, the appearance of early Homo. Because we share it with great apes, it's very spontaneous. We can't really control it very well. But these other ones are, if you like, historical, purely historical, in that they're behaviors we found that trigger the endorphin system and do so very effectively. And I'll just show you a bit of evidence for this, just to establish the point. First, this is one of our, another of our PET scanning neuroimaging studies showing the brain firing up after people have been made to laugh, watching comedy videos in groups. Again, you can see the whole brain going crazy. Excuse me. Again, the visual system at the back doesn't respond because there are no receptors for endorphins back there, but the rest of the brain gets filled up with an endorphin surge. We've looked particularly recently at the role of rituals in this context as one of the components of this toolkit of social bonding, if you like. Most of this work was done by my collaborators at Coventry University, Miguel Farias and Sarah Charles. And what they did was to look at, well, first of all, a whole group of about 13 different Christian churches, from a variety of Protestant and Catholic groups, and then look at some Afro-Caribbean services in Brazil in 11 different churches, as you might say, from the Umbanda religion, which is an Afro-Caribbean mixture of bits of Catholicism, bits of West African traditional religions, and so on. Yoga classes, which were done by presenting them as both secular, the same exercise, both secular and religious, so providing the yoga theory behind it, if you like, as opposed to just it's good for you and it makes you feel good because. And then finally, a set of 4 Sunday assembly meetings, which, as you probably know, are designed to mimic traditional Anglican church services, but to be non-religious. So there are things that equate to sermons, which are just sort of talks, and there's singing, but not of hymns, instead singing popular songs and so on. So the structure of the services, if you like, the communal gathering is very similar or modeled on Anglican services, but has no religious component to it. And all of these, we looked at the extent to which endorphins are flooded out as a result of taking part in the rituals involved in the service, and the sense of bonding that comes from that. This is what you get for the sense of bonding. These are the church services that we looked at in England. These are the 4 Sunday assembly ones. So this is the sense of bonding to the group or the congregation, if you like, before the service starts and at the end of the service, an hour later. And you can see for all of these, there's a steady increase in bonding. People feel more bonded to the community they're doing these things with as a result of the activities they get. And we used a pharmacological intervention to look at naltrexone. These were done on the Umbanda groups in Brazil and on the yoga groups. And what we've done here is give people, or some of the people, naltrexone, which blocks the receptors for endorphins, so you don't get the endorphin high. And here's the bonding index as a consequence of that. That you can see the people who are given a placebo, which was just sort of pharmacologically neutral pill that does nothing. They show this increase as before, same one as you see here essentially, but the people who are given naltrexone have a negative effect. They feel less bonded after the service than before. And these results here are from a survey I did within Britain of how bonded people feel to their congregation as a function of how often they attend religious services. I looked at a number of different other aspects of their social life and say, well, but this is the one I want to emphasize here, is the more often you attend services in your religion, whatever that religion happens to be, between yearly or less than yearly at this end to every day or more than every day, your sense of belonging to that community, as indexed by this inclusion in another self scale that's widely used in social psychology, increases dramatically. People feel much more bonded to the congregation. They feel that a bigger proportion of the congregation really are their family. The more often they go, the more often they take part in these activities. Okay, so in the context of traditional societies, this is simply reflecting that kind of engagement, that sense of bonding that's created by these very ancient mechanisms that really form part of the structure of very small scale traditional societies going back into the deep past. And as an aside, there's some suggestion, and just certainly the view that I've come to, is that the endorphin system is actually underpins trance state. So when you fire up the endorphin system dramatically like that, you get this dissociation between yourself and your body, if you like, that can tip you over into trance experiences, and as reflected in traditional small scale societies where you might go on spirit travels through the spirit universe and so on. But while this worked fine for the small scale societies that existed for most of our historical and evolutionary time frame, the whole thing hit a crisis in the Neolithic, and this is the point I really want to emphasize here. Essentially, the Neolithic changed everything. And in this context, the important thing is suddenly people started living in villages. Now, this is often attributed to the agricultural revolution, finding that you can plant foods and live by sowing and reaping, as they say, rather than hunter-gathering. But really, this is a kind of odd thing to say, partly because agriculture started before people started living in villages in the Neolithic. So in the few thousand years before the first villages appear, hunter-gatherers were actually planting crops and using them. And secondly, the technology involved is actually very, very simple. Even domestication of stock, and that comes several thousand years later after the first plantings. It's not technically very complex, but there is a major problem that living in villages creates, that is a general universal problem for all mammals, and particularly so for primates, and that is the stresses of living in close proximity are very destabilizing. At one level in particular, they have a terrible effect on female menstrual cycles. So the more stresses you have and the bigger the groups you live in, the less fertile the females are in the group as a result. And the whole of primate evolution can be understood as a series of processes of trying to solve this problem and find ways of minimizing these fertility or infertility effects, what we call the infertility trap of sociality. But it also increases stresses generally, and I'll show you some evidence in a moment that it really does have those kind of effects. But the issue here is that the appearance of settlements of this kind, particularly in places like the Levant in the Middle East, are associated with the first evidence of the rise of doctrinal religions. So doctrinal religions seem to have their origin sometime around 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, at the time of these settlements. You see evidence for religious spaces, temples, if you like, for religious symbolism of some kind, suggestion that there's a priestly hierarchy, is this hierarchical differentiation within societies. Okay, now let me, in the context of this, let me draw your attention to this rather surprising result. It's actually been known for a long time in terms of what are known as the axial age religions. Sort of the major religions have been understood to arise about the same time, somewhat later, around about 1,000 years ago, so 1,000 years BC, the first millennium BC. They all appear at the same time. So if you look at sort of the Abrahamic traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, the Chinese religions and so on. But if you broaden that a little bit and look at some of the other state religions like the Aztecs, the Incas or their predecessors down here, and some of the other tribal religions which are explicitly monogamous, so the pastoralist, Nilo-Hamitic groups, the Oromo, and so on, going down to the Maasai, who now live down here just below either side of the equator, the Igbo in West Africa, the Himba in Southern Africa. All of these turn out to be associated with these very narrow latitudinal band known as the subtropical zones. There's one to the north of the equator and one to the south. These are very, very narrow. They only occupy about 12% of the land surface. But all these monogamous religions, monotheistic religions and large-scale state doctrinal religions seem to have their origins in these areas. Some of them have drifted to other areas. So the Igbo have moved down from somewhere up here. Their origins are not entirely known, but they've moved down. They now live around here. And historically, they're known to have moved down. The Nilo-Hamitic pastoralists, the Maasai and the Oromo and all these other people are known to have moved down from the southern Sudan, up in this region up here, down into Ethiopia and down the Rift Valley down here. The Himba originally came from this area as part of that movement, although they're Bantu, but it looks, as it's understood, they adopted cattle keeping from this Nilo-Hamitic group in the course of their history. So there's something peculiar about these tropical zones here that seem to trigger the rise of doctrinal religions in particular. So let me try and explain what I think is going on here. So if you look at these tropical zones, that's where all the major Neolithic settlements occur. The earlier settlements later in the Americas than in the Old World, but all the appearance or this shift from hunter-gatherers to living in permanent settlements, semi-permanent settlements, occurs within these, or on the edge of the subtropical zone. There's only one case really, and that's the predecessors of the Incas in South America, but that's largely because the southern continents down here, that subtropical zone is associated with very large deserts, so it's not very conducive to agriculture. And again, there's major blockages in the north, at least in Asia, with the Mongolian and associated desert and semi-desert regions right across this area here, which appears to block their use for agriculture. So what you get up here is, as is the case down here, is either hunter-gatherers or pastoralists, but not agriculture. So agriculture seems to be limited to this subtropical zone. We often think of the Sahara here as a massive great desert, but that's very, very recent. If you go back to the beginning of the Neolithic, 10,000 years ago, in fact, it was green and very well watered. It was extremely luxuriant with lakes and rivers. You had hippos, crocodiles, fish, antelope, baboons, all of which species no longer occur there. The baboons provide a nice example of this. Their current northern limit is across this line here, roughly here, at the bottom of the Sahel zone, the sort of open semi-desert that buffers between the sort of forested areas here and the Sahara Desert proper there. But 10,000 years ago, that was where their upper limit was. They're very familiar to the Egyptians up in Egypt. It's where the baboon-headed god comes from, that they was part of their pantheon. And that's a shift of 850 miles, something in the order of 1,300 kilometers in their biogeographical distribution southwards towards the equator as a result of climate change, which kicked in about 4,000 years ago, so about 2000 BC. Now, what makes the subtropical zones particularly interesting from this point of view is the distribution of disease prevalence and the growing season length across latitude. So here's latitude from the equator, north or south, has the same thing. If you look at disease prevalence, it's very, very high around the equator and drops off quite quickly, becoming very, very low once you're into northern and southern whole Arctic regions. Growing season, on the other hand, which shows a similar pattern, but it has an opposite distribution in the sense that growing season is very high, right the way through to the edges of this subtropical zone, and then drops off very fast as you get into these cold climates up in the north in particular. And it's the difference between these two that imposing the major limits on population growth, which are much the greatest in the subtropical zone. So these are not, in fact, to scale, but either way, the point remains the same, is that the difference between them and the effect they have on holding population growth down is at its maximum in this subtropical zone. So it's an area in which populations can explode, and that's what seems to have happened. And what that seems to have done is, at least according to a historical sociologist, is lead to communities gathering together for self-protection within settled villages, and that's where the origin of villages come. Now, the problem you have then is just these increasing stresses. Now, to show you how great these stresses are, these are homicide data from hunter-gatherer societies. The open symbols here, they're the proportion of all deaths that are due to violence as opposed to other causes, accident or diseases. And you can see it just rises really steeply as a function of the living group, the size of group you're living in. Remember, hunter-gatherers, they live in these communities of 150, but that 150 does not live in the same place all the time. It's split up into a small number of camp groups, each typically of around 30 to 50. In fact, these are the sizes of the camp groups for these hunter-gatherer societies. So these are historical and contemporary hunter-gatherer societies. But the point is, violence is escalating very, very fast indeed, to the point where in these groups of 50, which is the largest you really see in hunter-gatherer societies, as much as 50% of the mortality is due to violence, fighting between individuals. So, you know, there is no way that you can carry on having bigger and bigger societies when that's the case. It simply isn't going to happen. This is laid on top of the fertility problems that the women are having as well. So what you get some sense of how this problem was solved if you plot then the same data for village societies, village-based horticulturalists, again, in ethnographic societies. So these are historical or contemporary ethnographic societies, South American native Indians, small-scale horticulturists like Papua New Guinea and so on like that. You see a very, very different pattern. And what you see is this sort of wave-like pattern whereby initially they seem to be following the hunter-gatherer data, and then it drops off very dramatically, and then starts to rise again, and then drops off again beyond it. We're still not getting to very big groups. These are only 200 to 300 people in a village. And what these waves are associated with is the introduction of ways of minimizing and controlling violence within society. It's often associated with men's clubs, with marital arrangements, with the bride service type arrangements, with having big feasts which create a sense of belonging. These are all small-scale traditional societies. They don't have doctrinal religions. They have shamanic type religions. And my suggestion is that then the shamanic to doctrinal transition that occurs further up this scale to the right somewhere when village sizes start to get to levels of 1,000 or so. And part of the reason for this, I think, is that if you look at the structure of human social groups and your own personal social networks, what you find is this very distinct layered structure in which you have a very small number of intimate friends and family, if you like, and then layers of increasing size, but decreasing emotional closeness and frequency of contact. And you hit this red line at about 150, the natural community size. And then we know these layers continue for at least 3 more layers beyond that, to a layer at about 500, which we equate to acquaintances, put the terms in here, a layer at 1500, which is putting names to faces. The 1500 is the average size of tribes in small-scale societies, and then the absolute limit beyond that is at 5,000, and that's the number of faces you can know whether you've seen them before or not, whether they're complete strangers. So the point is that really the amount of time or the quality of relationships out here in these outermost layers and beyond that is very, very weak indeed. Within these layers of up to 150, there are mechanisms like the sense of obligation and reciprocity and so on that allow you, because these are face-to-face relationships, to behave reasonably well towards other people. But once your community gets living in one space, gets beyond that layer, you're really dealing with people who are largely anonymous, and more of them are strangers, and you have no sense of obligation to them. And this is the point, I think, what I'm suggesting, at which doctrinal religions kick into place, because something much stronger is needed to hold down the violence, if you like. And that comes partly through top-down discipline that doctrinal religions provide. So you have priestly hierarchies threatening damnation if you don't behave well towards other members of the community, for example. But also this sense of commitment coming up from below, which creates a sense of belonging out of these strangers. So the fact they belong to the same religion as you turns them into family, in effect, and hence perhaps the reason that we use family terminology or kinship terminology so much in the context of religions, brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers and the family of the church and all these kind of terminologies. So just to finish off, let's go back to the issue of mysticism, because very important part of this argument is that this kind of small scale, ancestral, early form of mystical based religion hasn't gone away, it's still there. What's happened is the doctrinal theory, if you like, in terms of the theology and the practices and so on, have been bolted onto this underpinning ancient component. It's this underpinning ancient component that provides the emotional grounds for becoming a member of a particular religion. It's not the theology, if you like, it's an emotional response. And it seems to me we see the evidence of this constantly all the time, is that in that it produces a continual upwelling of cults and sects from underneath. And you see this in all the big doctrinal religions. If you look at their history, they're just full of small and large scale. Essentially, they start as cults built around charismatic leaders, individual charismatic leaders. Some of these then eventually become major religions in their own right. Many of them die out when, particularly within a generation or so of the death of the leader, the charismatic leader. But that kind of constant pressure, and I think this is going back to the fact that people feel much more comfortable in these very small scale groupings, communities, which turns out to be, this figure of about 150 or somewhere between 100 and 200, turns out to be the kind of optimal size for church congregations, at least within the Christian tradition. I've not seen any data from outside the Christian tradition, but across the Christian tradition, this seems to be optimal. And I've just reminded of an occasion when I was giving a talk at the Vatican Gregorian University on evolution and religion. And after I'd given my talk about the importance of this grouping size of 150, some priests, English priests sitting behind me, when I went back to my seat, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "This is very interesting because we are, all of us here, the priests from a particular parish in England. We've all come over for this meeting." And he said, our total parish is about 450 people, but they're divided between 3 Sunday masses, each of about 150. And the people from the 3 Sunday masses never talk to each other. They really are like 3 separate little parishes in there. So I thought that was a wonderful example of this. But it kind of reinforces the suggestion that having these small scale groupings work very, very effectively as your, if you like, your religious unit. And that this is what's causing this constant reversion to these small units based around charismatic leaders in particular, and the intimacy with which they send. And of course, because they're trance-based very often, they're extremely difficult to control, which is why the hierarchies in general don't like them. Think of the Sufis in Islam, the various sort of mystical sects, even some of the now revered groupings like the Franciscans, who were much viewed with deep doubt by the hierarchy initially, because it was so much, it seemed to be so mystical in a sense. Okay, so just to sum up the story, the central problem of social life really is community cohesion and how to reduce the disruptive effects of the stresses of living in large groups. that religion evolved originally to bond communities of relatively large size by primate standards. And we think that probably dates back to the appearance of archaic humans, the Neanderthals and the Heidelbergs, but in the form of trance-based shamanic type religions, lacking a theology, often lacking any sense of gods or anything like that, and with moral codes which are unrelated to the religion. There's no connection between the religion and moral code. That the doctrinal religions arose during the Neolithic to make it possible to live in very large mega communities, originally driven by safety or search for safety. And interestingly, actually, in terms of the axial age religions, so the major doctrinal religions as we have them, is their origins in that first millennium BC coincides with a major crash in the climate, which caused a lot of disruption across the whole of that band. We see it particularly well known in the Mediterranean. You get it associated with the sea peoples turning up across the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean, coming from somewhere to the north. Greece is usually blamed for this. They were Greek in origin, but they clearly came down from somewhere else further north, causing mayhem and destruction. There's huge swathes of the coastal plains around the Mediterranean where entire towns were just burnt to the ground, and cities burnt to the ground. And you see the same pattern right away across northern India and into the central belt in China, the Yellow River, Yangtze River belt, where again you get this same signature of major disruptions going on. So it looks like the kind of modern doctrinal religions, as opposed to the generic doctrinal religions, the axial age religions as we have them now, arising in response to increased social stress going on at the time. But it's kind of as a reminder that the doctrinal religions are in some sense contrived here, bolted on top of the natural setup, and that natural setup of kind of more intimate trance-based small scale religions just constantly causes fragmentation, constantly gives rise to small, often theologically dubious groupings that cause a lot of problems for the hierarchy. And then a lot of these ideas, or all these ideas, are in this book coming out next month, I think it is, end of February, early March, being published by Pelican, and in the US by Oxford University Press at the same time. So that's the story I have to tell you. I'm going to hand you back to Antoine. So.
Thank you very much for this really inspiring and thought-provoking presentation. Well, I would propose, I have prepared a short presentation, like a comment about how Robin's theory inspires me to read the Genesis. But if there are some questions regarding the content of the presentation, please. Dan.
Sam has a question.
Yes, so I was wondering, it seems to me that if there's a population in which stress induces infertility among females, that the rate of mutation to bring about a discorrelation between stress hormones and infertility is many times higher than the timescales you need to have social bonding to reduce stress. So I'd expect many times in the timescale for social grooming to have arisen, right, given the same mutation rate, just females, right, that have a higher stress tolerance. So it's not clear why this evolutionary trajectory we even ended up on. It seems like still a highly in need of more explanation. Let's put it like that.
Okay, yes, that's a very good question. There are two issues here. One, of course, is we must be careful to remember that we didn't live in these kind of mega communities that we live in now until very, very recently. So, you know, very large scale cities with their sink estates didn't appear until, you know, a few hundred years ago, really. And even villages or cities of 1,000 or a few thousand people. If you think of a place like Jericho or Catalhuic in Turkey and so on, these early Neolithic cities, there are just a few thousand people. So there's still kind of demographically within a stone's throw of the generic primate grouping sizes. Although, if we look at where we pass through the barrier for the limits on primate social group sizes, which is at about 50, which is the average size of groups in baboons and chimpanzees, the most social of the primates. That probably happened with the appearance of early Homo around 2 million years ago, the first appearance of the genus Homo. So, the scale of the effects, which become much more serious once you start to live in very big groups, really don't happen until very recent historical times, which is perhaps the point I'm trying to make here. And that kind of doesn't leave us a big window for major genetic changes. However, the real problem, I think, and the problem that primates are having to struggle to cope with in this context is that, and indeed mammals in general, is this whole mechanism that makes the fertility so sensitive to stress. Because what happens is the stress blocks the cascade of endocrines from the brain that triggers ovulation. So it doesn't stop the menstrual system operating. You get what look like perfectly normal menstrual cycles. It's just that they're unusually long. And then finally they crash because ovulation has not happened and go into the menstrual part of the cycle. Because the endocrine message through this cascade of endocrines from the brain doesn't turn up because it's been blocked very high in the system. Now the problem is that is there to solve another problem, which is a very major serious one, and that is to prevent females conceiving again when they're lactating. And this is a major problem for primates because primates lactate for so long. If you look at sort of generic small scale mammals, lactation covers a couple of weeks and that's it. But once you're into primates, the females, particularly in the larger primates, the females are lactating for a year. And the burden of carrying, the energetic burden of carrying both a fetus, a growing fetus, and a very heavy, demanding infant in terms of milk consumption at the same time just becomes too much. And we know that's the case from humans. It's historical data as well as contemporary data that in natural societies, let's say, where you can't go and buy pre-processed food off the shelf in your supermarket, which hugely increases the rate of energy throughput, that being pregnant at the same time as lactating invariably means that one or other of the babies will be lost because the body just doesn't have enough capacity to throughput that. So, this is an energetic constraint as much as anything else being solved by one problem, by one mechanism, which then, as often happens in biology, creates a stress somewhere else in the system, and the way that's being dealt with has been done by behavioral means. And you see that through primates. So what the females do in primates is form these grooming-based coalitions or alliances, which buffer them against the stresses of living in large groups. And that allows them to defer the infertility problem to group sizes that are outside the range, that are larger than the range that they optimally want for the kinds of habitats they live in. We can see that transition occurring across the mammals between those species that live in a more solitary existence with very small scale groups to very large ones. So there's the steepness of this infertility effect is so great that for mammals in general, you can't have realistically more than about 5 females living together in a group. And 7 is the absolute upper limit. When you get to 7, fertility is below replacement rate. So the groups and populations will go extinct. But once you get species that need to live in bigger groups for reasons, perfectly good ecological reasons, then they all introduce these behavioral mechanisms, generally based around the formation of alliances, either with other females or sometimes with males, that buffer them against the stresses of living in groups, because they just keep everybody else off your back a little bit, just enough to allow the system to work normally, as it were. So I think the problem here is it isn't a one gene cause one behavioral effect. That process or that standard mechanism is set within a much more complex biological system where there are knock-on effects elsewhere in the system that make it difficult to change the genetics dramatically without kind of upsetting everything else. And I think that often, that really is fundamentally important lesson in biological evolution that often gets overlooked. We tend to forget that animals are not trying to solve a single problem at any one moment, although from a genetics point of view, it's often very convenient to analyze problems in those ways, but we have to be careful about how we do that, because those individual problems for animals that they're trying to solve are set within a whole array of other problems which they're trying to solve simultaneously. So at the end of the day, fitness is a sort of an attempt to solve a large number of problems simultaneously in what amounts to a best of a bad job solution. They can never get a perfect solution to it, because if you solve one bit of it perfectly, it destabilizes something else and you go down the slippery slope. And that's what produces these kind of inverted U-shaped fitness curves that you often see in animals.
Please, Alfred, you have a comment to this.
Yes, I would like to share the screen if possible. I have a question. First, a comment and the question. It's going about the principle of causality. And in Latin, there's this lemma agere sequitur esse, doing follows being. So it means if you have certain activities which refer to spiritual things, which are outside the realm of science, then there should be something there. It's not only a behavior, but it is also something in being. And we have seen yesterday the role of art, mathematics, we have seen others sometimes, personal relations, before with love, to experience joy with the happiness of others, which is very difficult to imagine with a computer, by the way. But so now the question, is there a transition from hominin animal to Homo sapiens person? And it is not just a transition in behavior, but ontologically, real in being. And the second question related to it, if there's a transition, when did it occur?
Okay. I think the short answer to the first one is, of course, there is a dramatic transition. And I think this goes back to looking at the evolution of religion, that there is no identifiable thing that looks like religion in any other species of animals, despite attempts occasionally to claim that there is. There really isn't. And partly that's because religions, in some sense, involve belief in non-physical worlds, if you like, or non-physical beings, I say spiritual beings that exist on another plane other than the physical world that we can touch and feel, if you like. There's no sense anywhere of that. There can be sadness at the death of a close companion, maybe, which we believe there is evidence for in, let's say, elephants and chimpanzees, for example. But there's no sense of there being another plane of existence, a transcendent world, as it were, outside the immediate physical world. And that's a consequence, I would argue, of the capacity to mentalize. So what differentiates the primates from all other animals is this capacity, or at least the anthropoid primates, and particularly the smarter end of this primate spectrum, this capacity to understand what's going on in other people's minds. Humans do it much better than any of the primates do, and they have a capacity to write. So this is what's commonly known as theory of mind or mentalizing. The problem, if you like, with that whole area is that it's been focused on what children do at the age of 5, which is when they acquire theory of mind, technically defined, and not what adults can do. So theory of mind is, in philosophy of mind, is equivalent to second order intentionality, but adult humans can manage up to 5th order intentionality. So they can handle 5 mind states at the same time, just magnitudes better than 5-year-old children can do. And the best that great apes can do is what 5-year-old children can do. So as I have argued before that these mentalizing abilities are absolutely crucial to our understanding of religion, and that we can map them onto the size of particularly the frontal lobes of the brain. We know it's underpinned by the mentalizing neural circuit in the brain. We've used those relationships to estimate what mentalizing capacities of fossil humans are. None of these achieve 5th order intentionality until you get to anatomically modern human fossils. So the archaic humans would only have been able to manage about 4th order intentionality. Now this I think has a dramatic effect both on the quality of their culture, for example, the kinds of complexity of the stories they can tell, but it also affects the kinds of religious statements they can produce. And I think if you sit down and kind of figure out what kind of religious statements you can make with different orders of mentalizing, there seems to be an important phase transition between 4th and 5th order, in which religions shift from being what I call social religions to being communal religions. At a 5th order, at 4th order, you can tell me about your religious beliefs, but I don't have to believe you. But at 5th order, if I recognize and understand your religious statements, in some sense, I'm committed to agreeing with your religious statements. So it seems to be a crucial phase shift that occurs at that transition that demarcates religions in the modern sense that we have now could only have appeared with the appearance of humans. So this is an answer to both parts of that question, really, that there is a distinctly mental component to this, cognitive component. And if you like to equate that with a kind of spiritual sense, that's fine by me. I think they're kind of closely enough related. And that's very, very late indeed. So this is to recognize in some sense that archaic humans, the Heidelbergs and the Neanderthals, could have had religion in a kind of hunter-gatherer sense where there's no doctrinal components, but there are experiences of transcendental worlds. And this may be why they went so often into deep caves and left so many markers behind in terms of artwork and so on, burials. That you don't really still have the capacity for fully developed doctrinal type religions until you get into modern humans 200,000 years ago. But it still took a long time really for the emergence of full-blown doctrinal religions in the Neolithic, which is sometime after 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. So there's a long period of our existence as a species where you have rather what you might call perhaps rather primitive forms of religion, which are experiential rather than theological or doctrinal.
Thank you very much.
Mark, could you please, Professor Fox, could you?
Hello, yeah. So thank you for a very interesting lecture. So I'm Mark Fox, physicist from University of Sheffield. So my question is, so the development of advanced societies, size of societies and groupings increasing, and you've argued that sort of religion correlates with that. Question is, are you saying religion is kind of causing the growth of the sort of grouping size, or is it just coming as a way? Because I would say, well, that people are figuring out some kind of law and order system, and that's enabling them to live in society in some sort of civilized way, and once you've got that, you can just have religions, you've got the stability for the religion. I'm just wondering if it's a cause and effect, or if they're just going together.
It depends. I think the answer is, philosophically, it depends how you look at it, as it were, which is often the problem with kind of evolutionary arguments anyway. The best way I feel to look at all of this really is in terms of constraints on demographic effects. So the size of groups you can have are constrained across all species, really, of animals by a variety of processes, some of which are strictly ecological, for example, energy throughput in the organism, but some of which are the knock-on consequences, if you like, the inadvertent consequences, because evolution isn't very good at predicting the future from that point of view. It's a bit Heath Robinson. The consequences of that are triggered by those kind of phase transitions, if you like, in terms of increasing group size. So what you see through the whole course of primate evolution, especially so, I think, through human evolution, is what amounts to a series of phase transitions in which a glass ceiling is broken through. Somebody discovers something. It might be discovered in the genetic sense of a mutation arises, which allows something to happen, or it might be discovered literally in a cognitive sense, that somebody discovers some behavior that produces an effect that solves the problem in some way, which is what I think happens repeatedly in the later phases once you're into anatomically modern humans. So this is much more a constraints issue rather than a direct causal issue, in that what things like the appearance of religions is essentially solving the bonding problem and allowing them to increase group size further. So if you look at, in effect, if you were to look at the evolutionary process, historical process on the ground, you wouldn't see A happening and then B happening later. You see them both happening together, because one is removing a constraint on the continued development or evolution of the outcome variable. So it's a kind of much more systems-based approach, if you like, to evolutionary processes than perhaps is common. But the problem goes back to, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that all higher vertebrates, at the very least, are trying to solve many different ecological problems simultaneously, and they cannot get a perfect solution to all of them. They have to do a sort of bit of a Heath Robinson job in getting the best of a bad job that they can get out of it, and that nothing that they do is ever perfect. Nothing that any animal does in biological terms is ever perfect, because you're dealing with a very tightly integrated system. And so you have these knock-on consequences all the time, which that create another problem that you have to find a solution to, which in turn creates another problem somewhere else that you have to find a solution to. So a lot of these things are kind of, I don't know, it's the best way of putting them in terms of causality. They're simply removing constraints that would otherwise prevent evolution in the non-biological sense along a particular dimension of the biological world. And if that kind of answers the question you have.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they're obviously interrelated, aren't there? Feedback mechanisms between.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is very characteristic of primate evolution, because if you look at the evolution of, say, brain size and group size in primates, what is very distinctive is the fact that the two switch in tandem together. They switch together. It's a very tight co-evolutionary ratchet, if you like, that seems to be operating there. Whereas with other mammals, non-primate mammals, you can see one changing and then later the other dimension changes. And they might flip back. In primates, they never flip back. It is much more of a one-directional trajectory. And that's because they're using those social solutions to access environments that are increasingly more prone to predation, have higher predation risk, so more open habitats where they have fewer refuges and their only defense is group size. And of course, humans are kind of, in one way, the ultimate members of that dimension, in the sense that what demarcates the appearance of Homo is this move out onto much more open habitats and the development of a much more nomadic style of life, if you like. And that exposes you to very high predation environments, because those are the kinds of environments that are preferred by most of the big predators. And at the same time, you've got no trees to climb into, in a cartoon sort of version of this, to escape the predators. And it's arboreality that the smaller primates primarily rely on to avoid predators. It's being able to climb out of their reach. So, what humans in particular, and a few other primate, large-bodied primates that occupy similar kinds of habitats have done is simply to rely on being able to band together in large groups. And you have a choice in mammals as to how you do that. Well, I suppose birds as well, and probably fishes too. You can either have herds, which are very unstable, and it allows you great flexibility in response to the ecological stresses of living in groups. But on the other hand, you might just be caught on your own when the one predator turns up that week. Or you can live in these very stable bonded groups like the anthropoid primates, and a few of the other mammals. Elephants come to mind, horses come to mind, dolphins come to mind, that allow you, as a kind of risk minimizing strategy, to be always certain that whenever predators turn up, you will always be surrounded by your friends who won't desert you, but at a cost. And you have to solve those cost problems as sort of ancillary knock-on consequences in order to be able to do that. And they're very expensive in terms of cognition, because all these species that live in these kind of bonded groups have very big brains, and brains are expensive. Well, energetically expensive.
There is a question or comment by Theo.
Hi, thank you very much for that lecture. So I'm currently a master's student at Manchester, and I study physics and philosophy. My question is regarding predictions about the future bonding of large communities. So whether this is a fair assumption or not, if we assume that the fraction of the population that is religious is decreasing and will continue to decrease, what will, in order to keep these large communities and perhaps grow in size as well, what will, cohere that group?
This is the question of the millennium, probably. that we should all be worried about. The answer is, I think, the stresses of living in big groups, not just in terms of the fertility issue, but in terms of the levels of aggravation and therefore kind of destabilizing antisocial behavior and so on and so forth, sort of are increasing inevitably, and will do so simply because of increasing urbanization. And I forget what the figures are, but there's something in the order of currently 50% of the world population lives in major urban centers, say cities and mega cities. And by 2050, it'll be 80%, so these problems are constantly being compounded. And the problem is twofold, as I kind of hinted at earlier, is that the bigger and more compressed the social spatial environment you're living in, the worse the aggravations are, and at the same time, the more likely you are to be living among strangers rather than people you feel an emotional sense of obligation to, and might therefore mitigate your willingness to kind of shout at them or worse. So, you know, it does seem to me that there is a serious problem which we need to think about very carefully. And that is kind of inexorably going to get worse. Now, what all primate societies depend on is the capacity to what psychologists call inhibit prepotent activities. That's the sort of self-control, basically. And this is critically dependent on the size of the frontal lobes in the brain across primates, and even within humans. So, you know, people vary in their ability to inhibit their behavior, and those who are not very good at doing these things, we usually refer to as sociopaths or psychopaths, depending on the particular syndromes they have, or tend to be people who are not very good at controlling their impulses. So they tend to act before they think rather than think before they act. And there is a slight correlation, which we probably needn't go into here in terms of gender. It's actually quite strong, but males have a much greater tendency to act first and think afterwards than females do. So, but this is characteristic of all primate societies. Primate societies couldn't exist without this capacity to inhibit prepotent activities, or self-control, if you like, because essentially they are, in a strictly Rousseauian sense, social contracts. You know, to be able to live in that kind of society, I have to be able to give up something in order that everybody else gets a fair share of the benefits. So I have to bear a cost to be able to do it. And if I don't want to do it, that's fine, go away. Live on your own. It's perfectly okay, perfectly good evolutionary strategy. You just have to solve the predation problem, and then it's fair. But, you know, given that we are intensely social, that is our major solution, and everything depends really from science downwards in terms of you know, sort of our capacity to survive and live on being able to inhibit prepotent responses, in other words, to behave decently and to live communally. We have to find solutions to those. And of course, going back to this whole trajectory of primate social evolution, you know, it's all based on, and it's not a kind of one-way inevitability. There's no requirement that you have to live in bigger groups in evolution. It's just, you know, if you want to live in bigger groups, you have to solve these other problems. That the whole of primate and human evolution has been one of trying to find solutions to these stresses that the major component of which involves self-control, behaving decently, not to put too fine a point on it. And what we've done historically, as primates have done, has been to exploit the effects of the endorphin system to create this sense of warmness and belonging, as it were, to a group or to specific individuals, to dampen down these effects. And you know, we have a whole suite of activities. Almost everything we do socially has been involves this mechanism. So as I mentioned, singing, dancing, religious rituals, eating together, drinking alcohol together, telling emotional stories, all of which are very often components of religious rituals in any case, but are also a major component of social life. And the problem is they don't necessarily all scale very well. This is the problem with grooming. It doesn't really scale very well because of the intimacy of physical touch, which we still use. It's still a very important part of the system, but there's a limit on how many people you can go around grooming physically in that primate sense, stroking, cuddling, caressing, and so on. That has necessitated the discovery of these other behaviors, and most of them appear to be ones that are not particularly genetically underpinned. What we've done is discover behavioral ways of triggering the same endorphin system, rather than discovering something that's kind of biologically new in that sense. They all all have been attempts to kind of break through the glass ceilings that are imposed on community size. So, you know, what's the solution? Clearly, we cannot continue the way we are, otherwise Armageddon really is going to happen, almost certainly. But what are the solutions? I mean, I guess Mr. Zuckerberg will tell you it's the metaverse and Facebook. I'm a little skeptical of that myself. But yes, there is a sense in which it kind of works, but I don't actually think it works particularly well with bonding. I think the evidence points rather to the opposite way, that it's much too good at creating echo chambers and fragmentation of communities and networks rather than network building. But, you know, mass singing, mass campfire parties, you know, getting out there, big lunch type, everybody sits down one Saturday every year and has a street lunch together to build communities. You know, given your age and stage of life, I'm half depressingly going to have to say it's in your hands. You know, us old folk, there's nothing much we can do at this point, other than point out what the problem is and what some of the directions are. But it's the younger generation that actually the ones who are going to have to solve the problem.
Well, we have still a comment by Dan and Masi. You want to? Dan, please, Dan.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Dunbar. I'm Daniel Bernardus from Amsterdam. I'm a biologist, also systems biologist. I much appreciate your systems approach. Also very interested in philosophy, so my question is a bit more philosophical. From what you've said, and also now and in previous occasions, I gather that so a lot of people in the audience here are kind of rational-minded Christians, you could say. Mm-hmm. And I think one message I get from your work to us would be, you know, we ignore this spiritual or trance side of things at our own peril, yeah. In a way. Yeah. So, you know, the importance of you know, silence and kind of going beyond reason to something more intimate in a way. Now, as you will probably know, in Christian religion, the theology says that God is both truth and love. And the spiritual side of things is often associated with love. And you could say in a way that your argument points towards its importance and universality. And so my question would be, does that not also imply that this love aspect has some truth to it, because else it wouldn't really be so lasting in a way? So that is my question.
Yes, on all counts. is the answer. I should declare an interest here in that, in the same sense as we speak of lapsed Catholics, I'm a lapsed philosopher, but in that that's what I went to university to study. And it was actually the only thing that I was interested in at that age, and until I discovered it was so difficult and was made just by the nature of what was on offer at the university I went to, where you couldn't do philosophy on its own, you had to do philosophy with something else. And I chose psychology as the least bad option. But I discovered that perhaps philosophy was for people with incredibly large brains, far beyond the size that I could aspire to, because it was really so difficult. And psychology was a much easier way of making a living, or science was a much easier way of making a living. So I have some sympathy very much with the direction from which you're coming in that sense. So the answer is, I think the underlying message, in some sense, of what everything I'm saying is actually, yes, this whole emphasis in most religions on good behavior and underpinned by love or charity, as it's sometimes being called in the past, is very much the issue. It's all about social bonding, and the endorphin system does seem to underpin, beyond everything else, these intensely pro-social emotions, if you like, and mindsets. in humans in particular, but other primates, monkeys and apes too, and that it's that sense of both this, it produces both this sense of deep warmness and therefore things like obligation and so on, and trust in other individuals, but also creates this sense of detachment between the mind and the body, if you like, that allows you to have these kind of senses of being immersed in a community rather than just an individual fighting the rest of the world. And so, you know, if you like, all I'm doing is providing some biological stroke, pharmacological stroke, psychological evidence to support your case for the preeminence of love. I mean, we can no doubt argue philosophically about what term you should use for these things, but I think that's a very boring angels on a pinhead kind of philosophical problem. We kind of basically, I think, are just viewing the same world from different directions and therefore giving it different labels, if you like. But I'm perfectly happy to use your labels.
Thank you very much.
Excellent. Masi, please, you have something to say?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Professor Dunbar. I'm Masi Riera. I'm in Lausanne, environmental engineer working for the city of Lausanne in urbanism. So I was very interesting your talk, talking about villages and cities and Jericho. So I look for your book. I only wanted to comment that in urbanism, when you were thinking about sustainable cities, we talk about multipolarity of the cities to fraction, but to keep together. I think it's like a way to go. But your talk today opens other questions underneath this organization of the cities, and I only wanted to say this neighborhood perspective of the cities.
Yeah, the one lesson I think that I've kind of learned from spending 50 years now studying first primate social systems and the last 25 years, particularly trying to study humans, is that the kind of village structure, if you like, of larger scale things is the way to go. That somehow you have to create this sense of belonging. I think religions have been especially effective in creating a mega scale sense of belonging. It scales up extremely well in a way that a lot of the other tools we use for social bonding don't. So laughter is actually very, very small scale in its effectiveness. Things like eating together are limited by the number of people you can get around the table, and they can still talk to each other as opposed to just be somewhere in the same room. Religions seem to have a very, very effective way of scaling up to very large community sizes. Despite the fact that you know, they obviously seem to work best on this very small village scale. But I you know, keep coming back to extolling Switzerland as the way we should all go in terms of its federal structure. This probably has something to do with the fact that my grandmother was from Bern, but I won't blame the city of Bern for that, for my views. But I do kind of think that a more federal structure of that kind simply inevitably is going to work better. And these kind of hierarchy structured things where you have villages set within, if you like, something like communes set within you know, a larger scale state and so on, that it is a much more effective way of managing things when it's done properly. And that's to say, you know, the voters at the bottom have to feel that they, you know, are actually regulating what happens in, not just in particularly in their local area, their commune, if you like, but also at the state level, that they can do that. Now that you know, is a problem of scaling of political involvement. And that's the other big problem I think that we've had increasingly over the last centuries, maybe, that as our societies have got larger and larger, so, you know, the people at the bottom become more and more disillusioned that it doesn't matter what they do. So there's no point in voting, or even, why be engaged in the community? Why take part in voluntary activities? The bowling alone phenomenon that has become so famous. So yeah, I think, the solution to, maybe this is the solution to the earlier question, how do we cope with this in the future, is to have a much more clearly hierarchical structure that goes back to the size, natural size of groups. And if you think in terms of our voting system structure in the United Kingdom, for example, it actually goes back to Saxon times, is the basic unit. The 100, which is your unit for local elections, for your local council. And we're still using those same spatial units and in the whole of the structure of the voting system, despite the fact that instead of being literally just a village in size, as it was 1500 years ago, even probably 800 years ago, now it's packed full with maybe 10,000 people in a small village these days, in some, at least here anyway, probably not yet in Switzerland, but where everybody else is complete strangers, so you have no sense of obligation.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Thank you very much for your answer, and let's do solutions on the concrete.
Is it still a question, Anna? Do you want to comment something? Or
no, I actually had the same question as Theo about what do we see for the future as religion is declining, but that's been answered. So.
Well, in that case, I think we can end here. My comment regarding Genesis 9:3-5-6, in the light of Robin Dunbar's theory, I think this could be an interesting subject for another meeting with Robin, and we hope very much that we can also visit you in Oxford in summer when the COVID is away. Okay.
If
really,
we were allowed to travel again, yes.
Yes. But very warm thanks to you for having accepted to have this discussion with us. It was really interesting and inspiring. Thank you very much, Robin.
Thank you very much. And you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we keep in touch.
Okay, yes.
Okay. Bye to all. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.